What up, Fightful fam, and welcome to 1-2 Punch, episode 35. Player 1, Shakiel Mahjouri. Player 2, Sticky Nick Baldwin. Back again, right up there with Lucas Grandsire in terms of the most consistent guests on the show. Thanks for being back, my man.
You like the baby faces, apparently.
Yeah, we're the kids bop of MMA.
Yeah.
To various degrees of success, but we're all here.
I appreciate you having me.
The Justin Timberlake
good to be
of the
back.
Trio. Nick Baldwin.
That's you.
No, that's not me. Hey, do you wanna plug the interview you've got coming up to prove?
Sure, I can if you want.
Lead to my point here.
Sure. If it serves as a good segue, then I have no problem doing that. I'm interviewing Anderson Silva later today, so that'll be on theScore next week sometime. So looking forward to that.
Look at that, man. Anderson Silva getting the Nick Baldwin rub. You love to see it. Guys, welcome to 1-2 Punch. We're exclusive on Fightful Select, just like I'm exclusive in my monogamous relationship. So chances are, if you're behind the paywall, you know what's up. But in the event that we have some new viewers, this is 1-2 Punch. It's news talk, MMA, but on a win-lose-draw system. What that means is we're going to assign the week's biggest winners and losers before drawing up a little preview for UFC Vegas 27 Garbrandt Font this Saturday. And, just the typical disclaimer, we're not calling anyone a winner or a loser, except Joshua Fabia. That guy's a pretty big loser. But just, whose stock went up, whose stock went down, pay-per-view numbers, all that good stuff. Without further ado, let me shout out the graphics team for this fancy schmancy animation. Quick reminder, if you can, guys, we're watching this on Fightful Select, but if you're not already, head over to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/FightfulMMA. Hit subscribe, tap the notification bell. Hey, man, we got Jake Paul in the run-up today, and I got to thank the guy because he basically tripled our subscriber count over the last few weeks. So welcome, Jake Paul fans, I guess. We're happy to have you, as much as I may not always be happy to have Jake Paul in the sphere. Okay, let's get started. We're going to get to Jake Paul, but first I want to talk about what, to me, is like the most exciting news of the calendar year 2021, and that is MMA Fighting Steve Morocco spoke briefly with Diego, the Dream, the Nightmare, the Legend Sanchez, who confirmed that yes, he has dropped Joshua Fabia as his guru / coach / mentor. They are no longer working together. Joshua Fabia no longer has whatever it's called, like the power of attorney over Sanchez's career. And Sanchez said, he's going to collect his thoughts and he'll speak to the media next week. He'll put out a statement. But isn't this great news? Isn't it so nice that I put out a tweet, MMA breathes a selective sigh of relief. We're this close to just getting this guy out, hopefully for good.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few people I saw on Twitter and just talking to them that kind of felt bittersweet about the whole situation just because it felt kind of almost too late. Like there's so much damage had been done already. You can't really go back. And while that's true, I think the more appropriate response or the more likely response people should have is just this is great for Diego because he clearly has come to his senses. We don't know how or who convinced him or who he spoke to sort of come to this determination that maybe Joshua Fabia shouldn't be in his life. But we have to give Diego credit. Like nothing about this to me is bittersweet or oh, it's too late. Diego should have gone out earlier. To me, I'm just happy for him because clearly the Diego Sanchez Joshua Fabia partnership was not okay. It was terrible. Joshua Fabia, he is a loser, as he said a few minutes ago, and this just wasn't good. It wasn't a good situation. It was a terrible look for Diego Sanchez. And really, people were starting to become concerned about how big of an impact on Sanchez's beliefs and overall morals in his life Fabio was having. And it's based on some Instagram posts and some things he was saying, clearly did take a toll. So hopefully Diego is able to move past this kind of bad chapter of his career and really life. And hopefully there's some sort of new beginning, whether that's with the UFC or just in life in general. Hopefully he's able to move on. Clearly the right step or the step in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think, maybe in terms of his... so this is the one thing I'll say about the bittersweetness of it, and this is the only point I'll kind of give to the people who are saying that is, it was pretty clear that based on the way that Diego Sanchez and the UFC fell out, no one wanted to touch Diego with a 10-foot pole. I mean, even BKFC wasn't willing to pick that guy up, and they'll pick up two homeless guys off the street and slap him into a bare knuckle fight. So that is my only thing, and I'm hoping that now, even if Diego doesn't return to the UFC, now that he has been able to separate himself from Joshua, hopefully get himself into a better place, I think that on its own will Diego's gonna have to do a lot of PR, especially when it comes to his health, because that I think is the big issue. When the UFC and Dana White and Hunter Campbell and Sean Shelby decided to part ways, it had a lot to do with Diego and his camp not willing to confirm that he was medically okay to compete. Now, that's the thing that needs the most rectifying here, because no legitimate organization, or even half legitimate organization, is going to pick up Diego so long as he is not able to say and prove that he is medically fit to compete. So that, I agree. That is something Joshua Fabia seems to have done to Diego that could really have ended his chances to make money. And I don't really know where Diego Sanchez is going to find a lot of income now. I don't necessarily think he's like the most equipped to do broadcast work for the UFC. So I'll give him that point. But Diego Sanchez is 39. He's got like at least half his life to live. And if he can live the next half his life without the presence of this parasite, Joshua Fabia, I'm happy for him, right? His career may be over, but Diego Sanchez has a long life ahead of him, hopefully. And I would rather he live that life with Joshua as far away from him as possible.
The only other point I want to make about this is that just parting ways with Fabia doesn't necessarily mean Sanchez is immediately in a way better spot. Like, obviously, as I said, it's a step in the right direction and it's going to help, but it wasn't long ago at all. It was literally like a week or two ago that Diego Sanchez said on a radio program that he thinks the UFC and Dana White might try and have him killed, and whether that's Fabia feeding him this absurd opinion or thought. I mean, of course, I'm sure it was, but he wouldn't. I mean, if he didn't believe it at all himself, I don't think he would go on and say that, or at least it would seem less likely he'd do that. So just parting ways with a guy like a few days later, does that get rid of all those thoughts? I'm not sure. All I'm trying to say is we need to be a little cautious. Diego might still need help.
Yeah.
But that's okay. Like he can, of course, get help. But I think we need to keep in mind that just parting ways with somebody doesn't necessarily mean he's all of a sudden better and ready to resume his fighting career. Like,
so the way I look at it, right, is like Diego Sanchez has always been kind of out there. He's always been a bit of an outlier, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. I just think that makes him impressionable when he can find the one guy who will agree with him on all of his sort of far-fetched takes, and then lean into that, right? So I think, looking from the outside, and because I've seen these kind of people before, this is what they do. They find people who are vulnerable in that way, and they exploit it. Yeah. So while maybe it's in Diego's inclination to believe stuff like that, I don't think he would have jumped to the length of the UFC is going to assassinate me if it hadn't been for Joshua Fabia sort of leaning into that, right, and pushing those buttons. And in my personal life, I knew a guy, and I still know him. I just haven't seen him around much. From my understanding, came from a poor background, worked super hard, was like, was working a great job, and just like like a working man. He was a working man, and doing that and working hard and putting his nose to the dirt, he was affording to take care of not just him, but his siblings and his parents. And then one of these leeches got to him, pay me 6 figures for these lessons and I will turn you into a millionaire, a 10 millionaire. And he walked up to me with stuff like, hey, how would you feel if I used to run like a very, very small hip hop live production company for a year or two. We barely turned a profit. It was not at all my expertise. And he came to me and he's like, hey, how would you feel if I could get, what would you do with $1 million right now? I mean, stuff like that. I'm like, you're asking me how I would feel to get $1 million for my live events company? I'd really recommend no one gives me $1 million because I'll blow it. Right? Like, I'm not equipped to do that, and I knew that. But that's just the thing, right? It's like, you get a guy who's impressionable, and you exploit them. And the way I look at this Joshua Fabia situation is whatever... You pair a Fabia with a Sanchez, and as Fabia, you extort the worst parts about Sanchez. I don't want to say the worst parts, but the parts of Sanchez's personality and belief system that can be weaponized to the most severe degree.
Right.
And that's what I kind of feel like happened here. And hopefully he's got a good lawyer behind him now. And hopefully he's in touch with his family and stuff. And I hope this is the man. Sanchez is always going to be out there.
Yeah.
But you don't want him being exploited because of this. And that's what I'm hoping changes here. And I'm just sick of talking about Joshua Fabia.
I know.
F
I
that.
know.
Fuck that guy.
That was sort of my final thought, is that, us in the media, I mean, we obviously, we're in the business of clicks, and so Joshua Fabia and this Diego Sanchez story over the past month or so has been a pretty big one in the MMA world. And hopefully that changes. Like, hopefully this is kind of the last we have to hear about Fabia, because he really never was part of the MMA community. He never should have been part of it. And I hope we don't continue to cover Fabia for much longer, like after this is finally resolved, because there's just going to be no point, and it'll just be, not the coverage we want to do.
Last thing on this before we move on, it's kind of unrelated, but it also is. ESPN's Ariel Helwani always been really good to me, so I'm I'm a little defensive when people kind of come after him a little bit, and I'll admit that. He put out a tweet after the video of like Fabia smacking Sanchez upside the head up while he's hanging upside down, akin to like, I've kind of, what he said, and this is how I interpret, and it's not even my interpretation, this is what he basically, my interpretation of what he said, because I remember the tweet verbatim, so I don't want to mischaracterize it. But to me, what I read was something along the lines of, I've kind of kept my opinions about Fabia online to myself because I was being harassed and I don't really want to deal with it. And what people seem to ingest that as, I don't know how they got here, is, I've known about Fabia's craziness and wickedness for months and months, and I haven't said anything out of fear. I'm like, you are completely misunderstanding this case. If Ariel Helwani wants to stick to talking about Fabia on his show, which he has, and he has been for months, he was talking about Fabia last year. That is cool. Ariel, if he doesn't feel like getting whatever, we don't know the nature of the text, death threats, or anything else, by deciding to keep his personal opinion about Fabia off Twitter, there's nothing wrong with that. And I saw people, journalists in the space, coming at Ariel like, how dare you, you're so unethical, you're keeping information to yourself. I'm like, he wasn't keeping any information to himself, as far as I can see. Like,
that's nothing to report. If Joshua Fabia texted me right now and
that's
said,
your personal life, you're not under any obligation to share that.
Well, but also just, that's not even news. Like, Joshua Fabia, a guy who somehow has embedded himself in the MMA community. Yeah, he's in the headlines, but him saying to a reporter, "Hey, we don't like your article," or something worse, like, whether it is death threats or not, like that's not even like, that's not something Ariel should have reported, like, because for ethical reasons.
No, it's not. If he's feeling,
that's something I would want to ignore. I would not want to shed light on it, most likely, just because of how stupid it is.
Or maybe if that happened to me and it was bad enough, I take it to the police. So that's my private business, sure, right? Like, sure. That's not. Yeah, it was so strange that people were coming out, and people who work in the space, no one super noteworthy, people who work in the space are like, oh man, this is how unethical MMA journalism is. I'm like, what are you talking about? If I'm being harassed by someone, I am under no obligation to share that. That's my personal life. And people, so anyways, that was just weird to me. But I'm glad. And I had so many people on my Twitter timeline crapping on Ariel, and then be like, oh wait, he actually has been talking about this for a long time. And I'm like, I don't know, man. The more I get into Twitter, the more I hate it. I'm like, people are so quick to throw out just the most nuance lacking statements and stick by them. I'm like, these things matter, right? I had a friend, someone I consider a friend online, post something disparaging about Ariel. And then when he realized he was wrong, he kept the tweet up and just replied to himself and say, hey, I was wrong. And people would say, people said, well, if you're wrong, why don't you just take it down? And the person said, well, I want to own up to it. And I argued, well, I appreciate that, and I think it's great that you're owning up to it. 99% of people aren't going to see your reply buried in that tweet saying, hey, I was wrong. They're just going to see you disparaging Ariel and then retweet it and retweet it and retweet it.
Yeah.
So just think about the things you say, because they do have an effect. But anyway, that's social media. That's a losing battle.
The more we talk about Twitter and Joshua Fabia, the more bad moods we're in. So let's
move on, because I'm getting vaccinated today. I gotta get jumping after this podcast. It's all good. Hey, winner, winner, chicken dinner. Jake Paul signs his next fight deal with Showtime. Um, what space does Showtime now occupy in the combat sports bubble? Obviously, they're huge for their boxing, but it seems like they're taking this weird middle ground. I kind of find it refreshing. It's this middle ground between being taken seriously and not being taken seriously. With Triller, you had an organization that had something there with the Freak Show, and they should have leaned into it. What they did instead was start paying absurd amounts of money for like Teofimo Lopez, and that's just not their market. That's not their game. Their game is Mike Tyson, Roy Jones Jr. Their game is Jake Paul, Ben Askren, and they should lean into that. You have Showtime, who I think is a little better equipped to do something in the middle ground, even with Morning Combat. Like, I love Morning Combat as a program, but I think one of the allures is you have someone like Luke Thomas, who's a little more on the professional side in terms of his approach to coverage, and you have Brian Campbell, who leans a little more into the comedy, the slapstick, the everyday man's fan. And I think that dynamic is a small example of the brand Showtime is going for moving forward with all their combat sports content. You have Bellator, that's more on their professional end, and then you have this Jake Paul stuff. Do you think this is the right move for Showtime to get into the Jake Paul business?
I mean, I don't think it's a wrong move. I don't really think you can go wrong either way, just because Showtime. I don't think this all of a sudden will make people think bad about its other products like Showtime Boxing and Bellator. People will still tune in. People will still take that seriously. If Jake Paul boxing some dude who's 0-1 isn't your cup of tea, that just means you can keep watching, the real Showtime Boxing, and you don't have to tune into Jake Paul. But I don't think overall this paints a bad picture for Showtime, and their umbrella of entities, I guess you could say. So I think overall it's probably a good thing, just because Jake Paul clearly does sell. The pay-per-view for the Ben Askren fight in April seemed to have done quite a few number of buys for Triller. So why not capitalize on that?
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. Like the UFC brought in CM Punk, that didn't make people think about the UFC overall as an illegitimate company from there on out. So I don't think it's a bad move for Showtime. And I think for Paul, it's actually a really good move, because this kind of makes his whole thing look a little more legitimate.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it actually more legitimate if he continues to box non-boxers, but just from sort of the casual fan's eye, being on Showtime seems more legit than being on Triller.
I agree. And like you said, I think with Triller, they are the Carney Freak Show. So it's almost impossible to take them seriously at this point when they start signing real boxers. With Showtime, I think they're established enough that, they even say, Luke Thomas, build this up to be something it isn't. It's not me. And Showtime's like, no, we want you. So I appreciate that. For Showtime, I look at this maybe it doesn't bring a whole lot of long-term viewership to their combat sports programs, but it is a good payday. It's a really good payday because it's going to draw a ton of traffic. And beyond that, I think they're more accepting of what it is and aren't going to try and masquerade it as something it's not. And I think that's totally fine.
I mean, why not accept it? The reality is these sort of circus, freak show, sideshow, whatever you want to call it, these Jake Pauls and these DJ Diplo is going to take a boxing match, and you have the Lamar Odom versus the other guy. I mean, there's so many examples right now of these non-fighters fighting. It's kind of just a part of the sport now, whether you're talking about MMA or boxing. And I think companies like real promoters like the UFC or like Showtime on the boxing side or other boxing promotions just need to start accepting it, because it's going to make a lot of money, and it's just kind of a part of the sport now. And it's going to take a while for some people to accept it, because we're so used to seeing real high level boxing matches, but once in a while seeing Jake Paul knock out some dude, that's not the worst thing. It's not the worst thing.
Where do you stand on the idea of this is helping or hurting boxing or combat sports? The way I look at it is, I don't think it's gonna, having Jake Paul on a card isn't gonna suddenly add 100,000 new boxing fans to the market, nor do I think it's going to make people take boxing less seriously overall. I do think, though, the fact that we're seeing so much of this now, it's every week there's some sort of YouTube or a TikTok star boxing. there to me that like I my interest level ends at like Jake Paul and these bigger names that have some sort of implications on the greater sports world. If two YouTubers are boxing, I really couldn't care less. I'm not going to watch it. But I do feel like over time, if you're going to just have the words boxing, 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 fighting, 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 such a normalized part of the cultural lexicon, I do think probably long term that does have some sort of trickle down benefit for combat sports, just because it starts normalizing it to people. I think there's still a portion of people out there who are a little uncomfortable with the idea of fighting as a sport. And I think the more we just talk about it, the more it sort of desensitizes people, and it might pique a bit of interest over time, right?
I mean, yeah, I mean, to your point a minute ago, I think, geez, what was your point?
I rambled on. I don't know.
I'm having a big brain fart. Yeah, I didn't even remember what you were saying or what I was going to say. But like to your point, when you asked about does this affect, like, does this add new fans to boxing? Does it take away fans? I agree with you. I don't think it kind of really takes from either, because this is going to increase Jake Paul's fans, but I don't think everyone who tunes in just to see Jake Paul knock out a dude is going to tune in for Teofimo Lopez and for Tyson Fury and for all the real boxing stars. And then even though there's this sort of overall narrative of Jake Paul and these other YouTubers are going to ruin boxing, who is just going to stop tuning into all their favorite boxers and these high-level bouts just because once in a while Jake Paul fights? Like, that's not going to actually happen. People might be upset about it, like the boxing purists might be upset about it, but they're not going to stop watching. That's complete BS in my opinion. So this raises the pockets of Jake Paul, but I don't think this adds a ton to the overall sport of boxing. Neither does it take much away.
Yeah, and I don't agree with that. I agree with what you're saying, in that when boxing purists like, oh man, this makes a mockery of the sport. To who? Real boxing fans know that this is nonsense and that this has nothing to do with professional boxing. And fans who don't watch boxing but are tuning in for Jake Paul, boxing just isn't on their mind. They're not looking at it as like, if they're tuning in, it's because they have an interest in what Jake Paul's doing. It's not that they have an interest or a lack of interest in boxing. It's completely separate. It's completely divorced.
And I remember what I was going to say when I had that complete brain fart was, you mentioned how there's all these, suddenly there's like every YouTuber, it seems, is boxing. The point I wanted to make was it can get carried away. Like, we're still in sort of the very early days of this YouTube boxing era. And so there's not a ton of it right now. And I think a certain amount of sort of the Jake Pauls within sort of the Showtime boxing realm and their schedule and so on is okay. But if it's like 50% of what Showtime is bringing to the table of their product, then I think that's maybe a problem. I think this definitely can get carried away. So these promoters have to be careful just to sort of pick the right spots, because there can be too much.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I will say, I think the one loser in this whole situation, though, so long as UFC fighters keep accepting fights against Jake Paul or these boxers and losing, I don't think it hurts the sport overall. But as someone who covers it and has ambition and loves the sport and admires the fighters, it does suck when the boxing snobs come in and poke fun at UFC fighters for losing or having shitty hands. Like, I know Ben Askren is out there being like, I don't represent MMA, but he does.
It is in, like, he doesn't represent it himself, but in the eyes of a lot of people he does. And it is infuriating when people, like, you know, all the boxing people, or just like the regular like news people that don't really know much about MMA or boxing, like they say Ben Askren, this you know, scrub MMA fighter who's best known for getting knocked out by Masvidal in 5 seconds. And it's just like, I'm sitting here, like, I didn't follow all of Ben Askren's career, but I still know that he was the champion in Bellator. He defeated a bunch of great guys like Andrei Koreshkov, Douglas Lima, was in one championship. Like, this guy was a high level fighter, and to see people write him off as just like a guy because he got knocked out by Jake Paul is kind of
we're too close to the issue, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the losers, because like I said, about 20 minutes I gotta get out of here, get my vaccine. Very stoked for my mind control nanobot chip.
Yeah,
finally, it's about time.
The connection on the next podcast is gonna be great.
Yes. Quick reminder, guys, subscribe, notification bell, thumbs up, all that good stuff. All right, let's start with this. This one's very recent. And man, I hope do they rectify this. So, on less than 24 hours notice, Halion Paiva was hospitalized due to weight cut complications, right? And
Yeah.
so, and sorry, I don't know how to pronounce any of these names, but Juan Camillo Honduras steps in on less than 24 hours notice to fight David Dobrik, not David Dobrik, David Dobrik. And he misses weight because the dude stepped in on less than 24 hours notice. Like, same day. He gets brought in. It's like, hey, do you want to fight? Sure. The UFC tells MMA Fighting that he will be fined 20% of his purse, Juan Camillo will, for missing weight. Now, perhaps this is just sort of standard Nevada State Athletic Commission stuff, and so immediately there's no sort of rectifying that. But this is messed up, dude. The UFC better give this guy his 20% back.
Yeah, it's a strange situation just because when I heard about this, I thought back to the situation from the UFC Toronto card back in December 2018. I'm trying to remember the fight. A guy stepped in to fight Diego Ferreira. It was Jesse Ronson. I believe he stepped in to fight Diego Ferreira on maybe a week's notice. And then he was too heavy as the weigh-ins approached, so they pulled him for the fight, and Diego fought somebody else. And then the UFC matchmaker Sean Shelby was really upset with Ronson, and then ended up cutting him. And the story there was that Shelby and the UFC expected Ronson, based on what Ronson told them when he accepted the fight, they thought he'd be able to make weight. He clearly was way too heavy going in when he accepted it, and that was the whole issue. But that was still 7 days out. A day out, you can't expect anybody to be on weight, or even if you're a bantamweight, you can't expect them to weigh in right at 126, no problems. You got to give some leeway, and taking away 20% taking away 20% from somebody that did you a favor. The UFC is all about getting their fights, making sure they have 12 or 13 or whatever. And this guy saved the day per se. And then they take away 20% just because he did what we all expected him to do and miss weight. That's absurd, and he deserves that money.
Yeah, I guess it would be nice to know what sort of conversations went on behind the scenes. Did you say, "Oh no, man, I'm already on weight, whatever"? I guess it would be good to know that.
Yeah, but if he said, "Oh yeah, I'm at 124, I'll have no problem," and then he is completely lying. Fair enough, but even still, a day's notice, come on.
Do you know the logistics of this? So obviously the UFC is the one who negotiates the rate with the fighters, but then when they miss weight, is it the athletic commission that actually enforces the doc pay? And then who's negotiating between... Because the fighters negotiate if the fight's going to go on how much their purse. Are they negotiating with the UFC, or are they negotiating with the athletic commission? Because the way it works, I think the UFC gives the money to the athletic commissions, and then the commissions pay out the fighters, right?
Negotiating whether the fight continues is definitely with the UFC. The Nevada Commission, I'm sure, has nothing to do with that, because it's just negotiations between the two fighters, basically. As far as what amount they have to pay as a fine, I assume that's decided by the UFC, but that's a good question. I don't know. And then because the money goes to Nevada, to the commission, well, actually, I guess the money goes to other fighter, but it's through the commission. Honestly, I don't know.
It's a weird bureaucracy there.
Yeah.
All right, let's touch very quickly on Jacare Souza. Dude gets his arm snapped and then cut from the UFC. Crappy circumstances, but considering the fact that he went from losing to Kevin Holland, who to this point, dangerous striker, but clearly missing facets of the sport. They're going to stop him from competing at the highest level, and then losing this most recent fight where very talented grappler, but not a guy with a lot of name value. Was it appropriate to cut Jacare considering his string of losses?
Well, if we're going off what the UFC has been doing lately, based on Junior Dos Santos and Alistair Overeem and even Yoel Romero getting released, just because they get paid a lot and because they don't have a ton to offer anymore, it wasn't surprising. But are there guys on the roster that Jacare still could beat? Probably. Some low level middleweights, or even mid-tier middleweights. I'm not saying Jacare isn't washed up. At 41 years old, it's pretty clear that he is essentially done as a fighter and probably should retire, especially after this arm break, which was a nasty injury and a bad loss. but did he deserve to be cut? I mean, based on the talent level that the UFC has these days, I would say no, but it's not surprising just because the guy probably gets paid like $150,000 per fight.
Yeah.
That's money that they can save and spend on a contender series guy.
On like 4 contender series guys.
Well, exactly. And so it's all about, quantity over quality these days. But even still, like Jacare is done. Like, he shouldn't be fighting anymore, or at least not at that level. The one thing that you kind of remind me of when you said that just popped into my mind, it feels like such a UFC thing to do. I'm sure there has to be some sort of clause there where, like, if the injury happens in the fight and they get cut like a day later, the UFC still has to cover that and take care of him. But it's just something I thought of. Like, I don't know how that works, and I really hope that they didn't completely screw Jacare out of the care that he needs.
Yeah, for everything he's done with the company, especially.
Exactly.
Looking back at that submission, he gets his arm snapped in that fight with Andre Muniz. It looked like, to some degree, Jacare kind of snapped his own arm, right? Because he was violent. He was trapped in that arm bar. It was a pretty high arm bar. Like, he didn't have all his arm in. It was more kind of like on the forearm region. And Jacare was just shucking it off for dear life, and then it snaps. We've seen this before. He in a jiu-jitsu tournament let Roger Gracie snap his arm so that he would go on to win on points. We know that Jacare is like next level tough, but considering at where you're at in your career, the level of competition that you're fighting, where your placement is on the card, was that a smart decision from Jacare? I think there are fights like, let's say, John Jones, Vitor Belfort. Like, there's enough reason to risk having your arm snapped if it means you can continue fighting. Was that the fight to be stubborn with and potentially have broken your own arm?
I'd have to go back and look at the finish. Like, I never even when it happened on the night of the card, I never got a great look at sort of the sequence of how it happened. So I think your question might be a bit better, like for the Tony Ferguson heel hook against Beneil Dariush. Like, that was to me anyways, that was a more clear situation of where, hey, Ferguson knew he was in trouble. He easily could have tapped to prevent further damage happening to his ankle. But you even mentioned it yourself, like Jacare was moving his arm, he was trying to get out. So without looking back, all I can really say is perhaps he just thought there was a good chance that he was going to get out. Like, it's not like Muniz was holding his arm, completely hyperextending it, and it was clearly deep, and Jacare literally just sat there and let his arm be broken. Like, I don't know if that's what happened. So I don't think this was like where we can say, hey, Jacare messed up because he didn't tap. He's too tough for his own good. Like, I don't know if that's the situation, but it could be. But I'd have to watch it again.
Let's touch really quickly, since you mentioned it. Beneil Dariush, UFC 262, snatches a nasty heel hook on Tony Ferguson. Oh, God. Worst kind of submission you can have, too. Dariush said he heard Ferguson's knee pop really badly. And you could see the grimace on Ferguson's face. And if I'm not mistaken, it's the same knee that he just tore everything on when he tripped over those cables. The Tony Ferguson, Charles Oliveira one, I get more so because, it's your arm at the end of the day. It's not quite as nasty. The recovery time is better. It's not quite as debilitating of an injury. And at that time, Tony Ferguson was still firmly mixed, 1-2 fights away from a title picture against Beneil Dariush, risking damage, which to me it was very obvious that knee was compromised after, based on his stance switching and his scrambling on the ground. Like, he looked so immobilized compared to the first round. Was it worth it? Considering what win or loss to Beneil Dariush meant, was it worth ripping his knee? We don't know the extent of the injury, but let's just say it was bad.
I mean, I kind of have to sit in the middle a little bit here too, just because, Tony isn't thinking there, or he's not in that leg lock thinking, oh, like my knee or my ankle is definitely going to pop. Like, I'm definitely risking an injury. Like, we don't know what he was thinking. Like, he might have, injury might not have been on his mind. He might have thought he could have gotten out. Like, we don't, and he did get out. And so, like, I find it tough to say, hey, Tony Ferguson should have tapped. Like, it did seem like maybe it was deep enough where most fighters would tap. I think that's fair to say. But Tony Ferguson's trying to get back on track. Like, this was a big fight for him. He needed a win. And is it surprising that someone as tough as Tony Ferguson risked his ankle being torn or whatever happened for that win? No, not at all. So I can't really blame him. But in hindsight, was it maybe not the right call to not tap? Potentially. But the man's tough, and I'm not a doctor, so I don't know exactly what he was risking, like in terms of an injury.
Fair enough. Let's move on to, very quickly, UFC Vegas 27 this Saturday, headlined by bantamweight title contenders Rob Font, number 3, Cody Garbrandt, number 4. Now, Rob Font is one of these guys who always showed a ton of potential, kind of would hit a ceiling, lose a fight, stumble down the rankings a bit, but every time he'd reach a new high, right? This is one of those guys who's had a really slow but gradual career progression, the type I really like to see, kind of like Charles Oliveira in a sense, right? It's like every time he seems outgunned, the bounce back is stronger than the one before. He's now ranked number 3. A win versus Cody Garbrandt leaves only Peter Yan and Corey Sandhagen, and I guess TJ Dillashaw, if he wins, ahead of him in the rankings. So he's one fight away from a title fight, and there are circumstances in which he might find himself in there based on injuries, how the division shapes up, but he's super close. I think Cody Garbrandt has more to lose here just based on the name value and about how low his lows have been, just the repeated knockouts to TJ Dillashaw, to Pedro Munoz. If Cody loses this fight, especially if he gets knocked out again, is that the last we're going to hear about Cody Garbrandt in the bantamweight title picture? Because up until this point, the UFC, I think, has been very generous with him.
I don't think so. I guess my answer is more so like there's a chance he could get back. Like I don't think that chance goes away with a loss on Saturday. I'm not saying for sure he's going to get back to the title picture. Like it depends what would happen after that, whether he continues to lose or bounces back. But I think the possibility, even if he loses to Rob Font, to reach the title picture again is there, because the UFC really likes Cody Garbrandt. They have always looked at him as a potential star. He's never really turned into that, mostly because he lost the belt pretty much right away, never defended it. But he's sort of that guy that always has had that star potential, and I think the UFC still sees that in him. He's still young, he's exciting, he has knockout power. He's sort of that guy they want at the top of 135. And so even if he loses to Rob Font, maybe he sits out for a little bit, he'll take a bounce back fight, maybe he fights Marlon Rice or whoever, I don't know. And then he's right back there, because by then, Yan and Sterling have fought again. Sandhagen and Dillashaw have fought. Maybe even that fight between the winners have happened. Like for Cody Garbrandt, it never will take much to get back to that title position. For Rob Font, if he loses to Cody Garbrandt, now that's not a bad loss, but no one cares about Rob Font. And I say that I regrettingly, because Rob Font deserves a ton of buzz. This guy is exciting. He's a good guy. He has knockout power like Garbrandt, but he just has never connected with fans. He has like 15,000 followers on Twitter. Garbrandt has hundreds of thousands. So for Rob Font, there's in ways more at stake, because this is kind of his shot. If he beats Garbrandt, he's a title contender. If he loses, he's still a title contender, but he's not going to get that crack anytime soon.
Agree. So let's say win, lose, or draw here. There was a time where Cody Garbrandt was supposed to be paired up with Davison Figueiredo for a flyweight title shot. If Cody wins this fight, do we think he continues to hunt the bantamweight elite? Does that give him even better shot of moving down to flyweight and getting an immediate title fight? With a loss, based on who else in that division, would he still get an immediate title fight? Like, where do you think Cody Garbrandt goes from here?
Yeah, it's interesting. And to me, it really comes down to the timeline of the Aljamain Sterling Peter Yan rematch. And then, of course, we know already that Dillashaw and Sandhagen are rebooked for July 24th.
And that'll be the next fight, for title.
Let's say this fight, it's a back and forth fight, goes 25 minutes. Garbrandt needs some rest, but he wins. Maybe he sits out till the end of the year, lets those fights play out. But the problem is he's probably not going to jump ahead of Dillashaw or Sandhagen. The only way I could see him getting a title shot, like unless he just waits for like a year and a half, is if Sterling beats Yan and then Sandhagen beats Dillashaw, because I could see the UFC being hesitant to run back Sterling Sandhagen so soon to when Sterling submitted him in like a couple of minutes, especially when they have Garbrandt sitting right there, who's more popular than Corey Sandhagen. That's the only scenario. Otherwise, if he wins, I could see them doing the flyweight title fight because Figueiredo is set to fight Moreno in like a couple weeks. So that'll be over by the time time-wise it makes sense. If he loses, I don't see the flyweight title fight happening, not yet. Like, I just can't see how they can give him Davis and Figueiredo after losing to Rob Font. Like,
well, they gave Jose Aldo a title fight coming off a loss.
I know, but he arguably beat Marlon Royce. So you can't give him a title shot in a different division coming off loss. That, like, UFC does some crazy things, but that isn't happening. So, yeah, I mean,
based on what you said, let me give you my theory here. Cody Garbrandt beats Rob Font. Bantamweight's tied up for now. He moves down to flyweight. Let me say the Cody Garbrandt I've seen up to this point, I think loses to Davison Figueiredo. I think gets knocked off out, especially with the weight cut. That's not going to help his chin. But let's see. Maybe in the Rob Font fight, who's a very technical, diverse striker, long. Maybe Cody has shored up that aggression. We saw hints of it in the Rafael Sanso fight, but I need to see more of it. Let's see how he does against Rob Font. If he looks really good and has shored up his striking defense, I say he goes down to flyweight. And if he wins that fight, that timeline, I think, probably matches up really nicely for him to come back to bantamweight for a super fight against whoever's there.
Yeah. Just the
fight cards, you kind of have like, there's the main event, there's the people's main event, and then there's the hardcore's main event. Dude, all I see on my Twitter is Ben Rothwell versus Beast Boy Chris Barnett. I am shocked this man has finally made it to the UFC. Dude's fought at like super heavyweight before. He can still break dance in the cage. Are you as excited as I don't even know much about Chris Barnett, but I recognized the name immediately, and I was like, I am ready for this. I've booked this guy on WMMA4. Shout out to Grey Dog Software. I am ready for this fight.
It's funny because, like, when he got booked against Rothwell, like, I know the name Chris Barnett, but then I even sort of recognized it. But then when I looked at his Tapology record, I was like, have I even seen him fight? Like, maybe a Risen card that I just don't remember. Like, I don't even remember how I know him. Like, maybe it's just from Twitter because Caposo like talks about him. I don't know, but this guy's 5'9" and he's been fighting at like 300 pounds before. I'm stoked. Like, that's all you need. I hope this isn't a 3-round bore fest just because it has the potential of that. But him versus Ben Rothwell, who's equally as like bizarre, sign me up. Like, it's probably going to suck, but
I just don't think Chris Barnett is good enough for this fight to suck. And I say that with no disrespect. Like, let me go look at his record, but I just can't believe this dude is going to come in there and try and like jab his way to a decision.
No, but these heavyweights that are maybe not, you know, the Francis Ngannous and the Stipes, like the lower level UFC heavyweights, they don't come in trying to jab and then their fights end up being boring. They come in swinging, they miss, and then they tire out. Like, that's what could happen. I don't know enough about Chris Barnett to give like a real prediction as to what I actually think will happen. But I'm just saying this is two heavyweights that are like 260, and neither of them have amazing cardio, I would imagine. So there's that potential. Hopefully it's a first round knockout. Like, I'm hoping for a crazy, crazy fight, but you gotta be cautious with these heavyweights.
Got 16 of his 21 wins by knockout. He's 50-50 on KO and decision losses. So I'm hoping to see someone just get absolutely mushed into the pavement.
I mean, the man's never fought Ben Rothwell.
Yes.
So
what a character is Ben Rothwell. All right, Nick. That is all the time we got today. I gotta go get my injection. Very, very excited. Do you have yours yet? You have your first one?
I do.
Very good. Young Nicky B. Getting it done. Tell the people where they can find you. We've already pitched Anderson Silva. Please reiterate all the great work you're doing over at the
For sure. Well, appreciate you having me on again. Maybe like the third or fourth time. That has to be some sort of record. So
it's close.
I'll put that on the resume. You can find my work over at theScore. Download the Score app on the App Store, whether iPhone or Android. Go to the MMA section. Read all my decent work. I'm not going to say fantastic, but go check it out. We'll have coverage for the fights tonight for Bellator. We'll have UFC tomorrow. As I said, I'm interviewing Anderson Silva in just an hour or so. So that'll be up on the Score next week. I've also got an interview with Bruce Buffer next week, so that'll be fun.
Oh, sweet.
That'll also be on the Score next week. And just keep it locked, and you never know what's going to pop up in that MMA section.
That's great. I love that so much for you. Guys, so yeah, please go follow Nick. His social media is right there on the screen. You can follow me at Shaq_Fu. Thank you for subscribing to Fightful Select, our Patreon service. If you haven't already, last reminder, please hit that subscribe button, tap that notification bell, thumbs up, all that good stuff. We'll catch you next week. Time for my crappy outro. Stay tuned for everything Fightful and so delightful.